Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. I'm going to bring you this. I want to discuss with you what we see here, and then I'm going to segue into a paper that was published almost 10 years ago, exemplifies what I'm going to discuss with you in this first part here. This is a paper published earlier this year in April 2021. Climate has shifted the axis of the Earth, and it was in the American Geophysical Union. Okay, so glacial melting due to global warming is likely the cause of a shift in the movement of the poles that occurred in the 1990s. The locations of the North and South poles aren't static, unchanging spots on our planet. The axis Earth spins around, or more specifically, the surface that invisible line emerges from is always moving due to processes scientists still don't quite completely understand. The way water is distributed on Earth's surface is one factor that propels this drifting of the poles. Melting glaciers redistributed enough water to cause the direction of polar wander to turn and accelerate eastward during the mid-1990s, according to a new study in Geophysical Research Letters. Short-form reports with immediate implications spanning all Earth and space sciences. The faster ice melting under global warming was the most likely cause of the directional shift of the polar drift in the 1990s, said Shanshan Deng, a researcher at the Institute of Geographic Sciences, Natural Resources Research at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, University of Chinese Academy of Sciences, and an author of the new study. The Earth spins around an axis like a top, explained Vincent Humphrey, climate scientist, University of Zurich, not involved in this particular research. If the weight of a top is moved around, the spinning top would start to lean and wobble as its rotational axis changes. Same thing happens to the Earth as weight is shifted from one area to the other. Let me pause there for a moment. If the Earth was a solid sphere, and there's all land, no water, and there was no mountains, it's all flat, you would have a very uniform rotation. Now, come to planet Earth, we have continents, we have mountains, but you have oceans, and the oceans containing water, and that water is going to slosh around. So the Earth's rotation is going to cause buildup of fluid on one side, depletion on the other side. As it rotates, the sloshing is going to be uneven, and this unevenness will actually cause very minor, extremely minor changes in the angular momentum. And because the water is weight, the way you're constantly changing the distribution of this mass of water that will in turn affect how the planet rotates. Now, what they're saying here is, now we take in, notice they're not looking at Arctic sea ice because sea ice is simply the ocean freezing up. We're looking at land ice melting, that mass added to the ocean. So instead of having the mass of ice, Greenland, Antarctica, Alpine, you now melt that and you add that to the oceans. So you're adding mass, you are now redistributing that mass, and this is going to impact how the planet rotates. And since it's rotating and it's sloshing and the angular momentum is always slightly perturbed, the planet itself wobbles. And that wobbling is a result of the redistribution of the mass. Now, one thing I did not see mentioned in this little summary that I'm going to mention to you, but it is mentioned in my follow-up, is Milankovitch. Did they tease out the Milankovitch signal, specifically the Precession one, 21,000 years cycle approximately of the Earth wobbling the tilt of its axis going between 23 to 26 degrees or so, and back. Did they tease out that part of the Milankovitch cycle from this effect being observed now? That's an important aspect, needs to be specified. Now, of course, with this, as the Earth wobbles and tilts and constantly changing, it's doing what? It is changing how the solar insolation, the sun energy coming into the planet, it changes the distribution of that heat energy across the surface of the planet. You change the heat distribution, be it on land and ocean, you're going to do what? You're going to affect jet streams, air, atmospheric cells. You're going to impact wind direction. You're going to alter that. And with that, you're going to alter precipitation patterns. And the next article I will share with you dramatically demonstrates that. Okay. Continuing on here. Researchers have been able to determine the causes of polar drift starting from 2002 based on data from the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, GRACE for short, joint mission by NASA and German Aerospace Center. Basically put up a bunch of satellites, follow up in 2018. The mission gathered information on how mass is distributed around the planet by measuring uneven changes in gravity at different points, often referred to as geodesic heights, geodesic potentials. Previous studies released on the GRACE mission data reveal some of the reasons for later changes in direction. For example, research has determined more recent movements of the North Pole away from Canada and toward Russia to be caused by factors like molten iron in the Earth's outer core. Other shifts are caused in part by what's called the terrestrial water storage chain, the process by which all water on land, including frozen water in glaciers and groundwater stored under our continent, is being lost through melting and groundwater pumping. The authors of the new study opine that this water loss on land contributed to the shifts in the polar drift in the past 2 decades by changing the way mass is distributed around the world. Kind of what I was trying to describe a few moments ago. And they wanted to see if that would explain what happened in the mid-1990s. In 1995, the direction of polar drift shifted from southward to eastward. The average speed of drift from 95 to 2020 also increased about 17 times from the average speed recorded from 81 to 95. Researchers found a way to wind the modern pole tracking analysis backwards in time to learn why this drift occurred. The new research calculates the total land water loss in the 1990s before the GRACE mission began. And Suxia Liu, a hydrologist at the Institute of Geographic Sciences and Natural Resources research at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, yada yada. The findings offer a clue for studying past climate-driven polar motion. The goal of the project, funded by the Ministry of Science and Technology of China, is to explore the relationship between water and polar motion. On the water loss and polar drift, using the data on glacier loss and estimations of groundwater pumping, Liu and her colleagues calculated how the water stored on land changed. They found that the contributions of water loss from the polar region is the main driver of polar drift, and with contributions from water loss in non-polar regions. Together, all this water loss explained the eastward change in polar drift. Basically, we're redistributing the mass, it's causing a wobble, and that drifting is basically is affecting, in essence, the tilt of the planet. So Humphrey Basin says it tells how strong this mass changes. It's so big, it could change the axis of the Earth. Now, this change isn't enough to affect our daily lives. It could change the length of day we experience by, say just several milliseconds. Now, Earth is slowing down. The angular momentum is slowing down. A day on Earth, when it first started really coalescing, was about 10 hours. And now we're at, we say 24 hours, it's like 23 minutes, 56, 23 hours, 56 minutes, and a handful of seconds. The faster ice melting could not entirely explain the shift. While I didn't analyze this specifically, Deng speculates that the slight gap might be due to activities involving land water storage in non-polar regions, such as unsustainable groundwater pumping for agriculture. Think Oglala Reservoir under the plains of North America. Humphrey said this evidence reveals how much direct human activity can have an impact on changes to the mass of water on land. Their analysis revealed large changes in water mass in areas like California, northern Texas, region around Beijing, and northern India. For example, all areas have been pumping large amounts of groundwater for agricultural use. Humphrey says the groundwater contribution is important. Wu said the research has large implications for understanding of land water storage. Earlier in the 20th century, there's 176 years of data on polar drift. By using some of the methods highlighted by her and a colleague, you can use these to basically project changes in direction and speed to see how much land water was lost in past years. So again, you're changing you're moving water. Either you're melting the terrestrial glaciers or pumping the groundwater, but you're moving that mass around. You're redistributing it. You're changing, how the Earth rotates. You're affecting the tilt of the planet. And these are things that are being observed and quantified. Now, look at this one. Green Sahara, African humid periods paced by Earth's orbital changes. Now, I said this came out in basically 2012, and I will include the URL in the comments section below. But this is really fascinating. And I think, rather than just end the video where I just left off from the previous one, I think going to here is a good example of illustrating what we were just prior discussing. Paleoclimate and archaeological evidence informs us that 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Earth's slow orbital wobble transformed today's Sahara Desert to a land covered with vegetation and lakes. So here we have a photo. And see if I can go over this a little. As he crossed by caravan from Tripoli to Timbuktu in the mid-1800s, the German explorer Heinrich Barth became the first European to discover the then mysterious prehistoric Saharan rock paintings and engravings, which we now know date back to the African Humid period, a humid phase across North Africa which peaked between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. So these images depict pastoral scenes with lots of large fauna. And the Sahara is very likely the world's largest art museum with hundreds of thousands. Okay, blah, blah, blah. The incongruence of these lively images intrigued Barth, who noticed that the artwork bears testimony to a state of life very different from what we are accustomed to seeing in these regions now. Fair point. And here's some examples of the artwork. Very nice indeed. This is the arrow showing its current location and some shoreline there or what have you. We now know these images document a dramatic change across North Africa from the hyper-arid desert it is today to a nearly completely vegetated landscape dotted with large and small lakes during the early and middle Holocene epoch. And this event, commonly called the African Humid Period, or AHP. It was a direct result of African monsoonal climate responses to periodic variations in the Earth's orbit around the Sun that recur roughly every 20,000 years. The AHP is just the most recent of hundreds of earlier humid events spanning as far back as the Miocene, about 9 million years ago, possibly earlier. So the orbital forcing, okay, basically going to describe Milankovitch here. Okay? Earth's axial rotation is perturbed by gravitational interactions with the moon and the more massive planets, Jupiter, Saturn, right? Jupiter especially, that together induce periodic changes in the Earth's orbit, including a 100,000 year cycle in the shape of the orbit, also known as eccentricity, where it goes from an almost perfect circular orbit, but it still is elliptical, it's not a perfect circle, almost, to a bit more elliptical. And that's again over 100,000 years. A 41,000 year cycle in the tilt of the Earth's axis, obliquity, and a 20,000 year cycle in the wobble. This is called precession of the Earth's axis. Now, the wobble is when the axis goes between 23 and 26 degrees tilt. By the way, during interglacial periods, when planet is warming up, the Earth is at its highest tilt of the axis. It's approaching basically and around 26 degrees. When it gets to the 23 end of thing, that's when the planet will start cooling down, and we can help induce the formation of the glaciers, the ice sheets. Now, what we found earlier with the changing water masses, that we could be affecting this wobble, this tilt of the axis, so that it could change this 21,000 year cycle or make it more extreme. Maybe you go 26.3 degrees tilt or something like that. You get the idea. Now, the obliquity is basically, where is the, axis pointed to the sun? Where is that occurring in relation to the Earth's orbit? For example, right now in the northern hemisphere, we're tilted away from the sun, okay? And that tilt will pretty much, the greatest tilt will pretty much occur on the winter solstice, right? And it doesn't quite coincide, but it's almost there with for the planet Earth, we would be at perihelion. In the summertime, when the northern hemisphere is really pointed towards the sun, the greatest aiming of it, as you will, that takes place at aphelion, and then it's reversed for the southern hemisphere. Well, that how say the northern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun, that slides around on the orbit, so that where the greatest tilt towards the sun may not occur at aphelion, or the greatest tilt away may not occur at perihelion, but at other points in the orbit. That's the 41,000 year cycle. If you want more detail on this, I did a video on the Milankovitch cycles. Please go check that out. I explained it all with diagrams and figures, and so you can picture what's happening. So these three orbital cycles, the Milankovitch cycle, impact African climate on long geological timescales, but the cycle with the most influence on the rains in Africa is the Precession. The main climatic effect of precession is to shift the season when the Earth has its closest pass to the sun, perihelion, the so-called precession of the equinoxes. Okay? That also ties into obliquity, by the way. Today, perihelion occurs in the northern hemisphere winter, but at 10,000 years ago, half a precession cycle, it occurred in Northern Hemisphere summer, and summer radiation over North Africa was about 7% higher than it is today. So they have some diagrams here, pictured at about 20 degrees north latitude, given in watts per square meter. And let me just scroll down here so you can see how this lines up. This is 0 is present day, then 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years before present. In other words, they're covering a single precession cycle. And what we see here is you can see the heat energy reached its peak, basically about that 9,000 years ago that they mentioned earlier. And they track some dust flux, some river outflow. And by the way, you can see this here. They use a lot of Del 18 oxygen in the seawater to ascertain, reconstruct past conditions. And if you want to know how that's done, I did a video, isotopic fractionation, explaining how we use isotopic fractionation to reconstruct past climate conditions. And then they look at the del deuterium, that's H2, hydrogen there, and how that changes. But we can clearly see how if you look at these peaks here, they pretty much line up when the Sahara was green. Makes sense. You got water input, you got heat energy increasing. It will promote vegetative growth. Orbital precession greatly influences North African climate because it controls the strength, northward penetration of monsoonal rains. Strengthening summer season solar causes the North African landmass to heat up relative to the adjacent Atlantic Ocean due to the lower thermal inertia of the land surface relative to the upper ocean mixed layer. That's another way of saying water has a higher heat capacity, so stores more energy, has a greater thermal inertia than land, which has a lower heat specific heat capacity aspect. The lower landmass creates a broad low pressure zone, driving inflow of moist air from the tropical Atlantic. The resulting summer monsoonal rains nourish the landscape. During winter, the land cools relative to the ocean. The winds reverse. That's a definition of a monsoon, returning dry conditions across North Africa. Since precession controls summer insolation, it effectively controls the amount and northward penetration of the monsoonal rain into North Africa. Simple atmosphere-only climate models shown that a 7% increase in summer radiation, similar to what occurred during the AHP, results in at least a 17% increase in African monsoonal rainfall, up to 50% if the ocean feedbacks are included. And then they take you into evidence for the African humid period. And this is where they talk about looking at past lake level reconstructions, looking at isotopic information. Looking at the geology, you find the evidence of lakes that existed in the past. And here's a distribution of the lakes here. You can see there's a lot here in the Sahara, much higher than current levels are. And they discuss the Nile River drainage basin. It's the largest of North Africa, draining run off from the eastern Sahara, Ethiopian highlands, and equatorial East Africa into the eastern Mediterranean. Today, the largest contributor is the Blue Nile tributary, which drains summer monsoonal runoff from the Ethiopian highlands. During the African humid period, AHP, enhanced Nile River runoff flooded into the eastern Mediterranean Sea, where the resulting freshwater cap led to anoxic conditions and deposition of organic-rich sapropel deposits on the sea floor. Radiocarbon dates of these sapropel deposits constrained peak Nile River runoff to between 11 and 6,000 years ago. Longer stratigraphic sections extending as far back as the Miocene contain hundreds of these layers, each representative of an earlier African humid phase, excuse me, and each paced by the characteristic orbital precession of about 20,000 years or so. And they're packed into groups of 4 and 5, and that's what this is showing. There it is, right there. It's tilted because of, uplift and that kind of stuff. And of course, you have to factor in, the change in the eccentricity, where the obliquity, that kind of stuff there, how that all impacts the precession, how this all impacts heat distribution, and for that matter, precipitation distribution across the surface of the planet. They describe how they looked at wind-blown dust, and so they take cores, and then in the cores they look at identify the dust. They can identify pollen, microfossils. You can then run isotopic fractionation analyses on those and help you in the reconstruction. I will leave the URL for this in the comments section. You can then pull it up, read the details if you are so inclined. So, on the timing and abruptness, although the African paleoclimate records show in figures 2 and 3 document the continental-wide pervasiveness of the AHP, the transitions in and out have not been synchronous across all of North Africa, nor were they likely uniformly abrupt. For example, pollen record of paleovegetation change in the eastern Sahara extracted from a sediment core from Lake Yoa in northern Chad documents a gradual end of humid conditions between 5 to 3,000 years before present. Also transects the paleohydrological, paleoecological data from the eastern Sahara indicate the transition out of the humid period was time transgressive, with dry conditions established earlier in the north, Egypt, and later in the south, Sudan, East Africa. One abrupt event that appears to be synchronous across much of North and East Africa is the occurrence of dry conditions during the Younger Dryas period, which is 12,700 years ago to about 11,500 years ago, when cool conditions prevailed over much of the northern hemisphere, particularly over the North Atlantic Ocean. And I appreciate this right here, referencing Wally Broker. He was the gentleman that pioneered the use of isotopic fractionation, demonstrated the conveyor belt going on and off. He is the grandfather of climate science. One of the most fascinating aspects of the African human period is the impact on North African human sustainability and cultural development. North Africa was nearly completely vegetated during the height of the AHP and populated with nomadic hunter-gatherer communities that increasingly practiced pastoralism, which is basically husbandry of cattle, sheep, goat, livestock. Towards the end of the AHP, between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, the progressive desiccation of the region led to widespread depopulation and abandonment of North African sites. These populations did not disappear. They went elsewhere. The large-scale exodus was coinciding with the rise of sedentary life and pharaonic culture along the Nile River. Okay, so in summary, the African human period exemplifies the dramatic climate transitions that our planet experiences as a result of subtle changes in the Earth's orbit. The greening of the Sahara not only represents a remarkable transformation of the hydrological cycle, but evidence that gradual climate forcing can result in rapid climate responses. Let me highlight that. Gradual climate forcing can result in rapid climate responses. So what do you think rapid climate forcing will result in? Just take a look at recent headlines. The wealth of North African paleoclimate and archaeological data highlights the fundamental importance of water availability on sustainability and human population, and the central role of climate in shaping major events in cultural development, leading to the rise of complex urban cultures. Okay, so now juxtapose that with what I discussed earlier, how we're redistributing the water mass around the planet. That means we're affecting the wobble of the planet. We're affecting the tilt of the axis. We're affecting, the angular momentum. We're affecting all these things, which is going to affect atmospheric cell patterns, which is therefore going to affect air currents. And then if you're affecting air currents, you're going to affect oceanic current. And if you're affecting those, you're going to change precipitation patterns and precipitation distribution patterns across the planet, so that you could end up with, wet areas becoming wetter, dry areas becoming drier, as I've discussed with you, one of the aspects of climate change. Wet areas tend to get wetter, dry areas will tend to be drier. So it's all tied together. So this is a sort of a natural example that demonstrates what was discussed in this article that I just covered with you. We are not only affecting the climate, we're affecting how the planet moves about. We're affecting the axis of the planet, and however small a way. As I said earlier, it would be good to see them tease out the Milankovitch part of the signal from the anthropomorphic part of the signal to see exactly what is our percentage of contribution to this. So I hope you found this interesting, and until next time, thank you for your time. Hello folks, this is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.